Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am, like others, pleased to take part in today's debate and pleased to offer my support to the general principles of this bill. The objectives of the bill are shared across all the parties in this chamber, and that is better protection for our communities and individual families from flooding. We know flooding is on the increase because of climate change and the way the Minister set out, and we also know that the flooding legislation is outdated and the procedures are too slow. And the price of failure to act would be to just enhance the kind of misery and devastation that Angela Constance has just very fulsomely set out is the consequence of flooding events. Now, for the most part, Presiding Officer, the bill's provisions are fine. Its provisions, however, are still very complex, and I think that there is going to be a lot of explaining required over the coming period of time. I very much welcome the new role for SEPA, taking a national lead in these matters. Welcome the planning on a river catchment basis as a sensible basis to proceed. I welcome too the national overview, but that combined with local delivery of the provision to protect communities. I'd also recognise and welcome the identification of responsible authorities and making those authorities' responsibilities clear. And there's perhaps a bit more work to be done on that as we move forward. And I also very much welcome the provision for deemed planning consent. The current procedures are far too cumbersome and duplicative, and that means delay for everybody involved and frustration. But for all those welcomes, Presiding Officer, there could be matters that could strengthen the bill, and that's what I want to turn to now. The committees argued that the role of SEPA could be further strengthened and SEPA be obliged to make sure that it takes a long-term strategic view of needs and priorities for flooding across the country, producing a strategic assessment for 6 years ahead, but also for subsequent years up to a period of 24 years. But not just that it's important that SEPA do that and are obliged to do that, but also that ministers have regard to what SEPA say in that respect. Then we'd have a national view, which would aid public understanding of the issues. It would also aid public debate, but it would also assist ministers to decide the quantums of cash required into the future, but also have a clue to the distribution of that cash as well. The bill could also be strengthened with regard to sustainability, and I welcome the Minister's concession on that today. With respect, I won't, because I've got a lot to get through in the short time. I also wanted to draw attention to the point that Rosanna Cunningham made about strengthening the provisions about natural flood management approaches. Now, this is no panacea to flooding problems, but the ability of natural flooding processes to make a contribution is there, and it can be very significant. And if you can take the peaks off floods by these mechanisms, then you can ease the hard engineering that will also often be required. There's a double benefit from natural flood techniques. Not only do you protect people from flooding to a greater extent, but you also enhance habitat in our countryside, and that too is of benefit. But as Rosanna Cunningham says, the real reason for the committee making its recommendations here is to secure a culture shift. It is the case, I think, and I speak from a position of having been in a local authority for many years, that the skills sets of local authorities tend to be engineering, and that tends to a view that engineering solutions are the limit of what we need to think about. We need to change that culture, and that's why the committee has made a specific recommendation for SEPA and councils to consider what contribution natural flooding techniques can make. There is also scope to improve provisions for councils to use their best endeavours to implement the flood risk plans. And again, I welcome the Minister's indication that he will bring forward an amendment in the bill about that. And I look forward to seeing the wording of that, because I think that needs to be explicit and very powerful as an amendment. I hope that will be the case. I also welcome the indication that that is going to take place, because this is not just about a dialogue between councils and the government and a deal between councils and the government. Citizens and communities have got rights in these matters, and they need certainty too that what's agreed for their community will actually be implemented. I would also like further reassurance, which I haven't heard today yet, about ensuring that the ability of Scottish Water to play its full part in the provisions of this bill will not be compromised, and that relates to the role of the Water Industry Commissioner. The Minister did indicate that he thought in evidence that there was scope for a conversation to take place with the WIC to clarify matters, and I think it's very important that we put beyond any doubt at all that Scottish Water can act in a way that is in the spirit of the bill and to find sustainable solutions to flooding and not be compromised in that by the provisions and powers of the Water Industry Commissioner. Finally, Presiding Officer, I wanted to touch on the question of funding in a broader sense. The committee has made specific recommendations about the funding approach. I was sorry to hear what the Minister said about that, and I hope there is still time to reconsider that, because it would be dreadful if we got to a situation where the good provisions of this bill were frustrated because of the lack of finance and the targeting of finance in the way that the committee clearly believes is going to be necessary. We are giving the government another opportunity to think about that through the committee report, and I hope there will be further thinking about that before we get to stage 2, Presiding Officer. As I say, I support the general principles. It is hugely important to make progress in this, to speed up the processes of flood management. The bill is very welcome for what it does provide. I've indicated that the committee will look forward, as I will individually, to seeing the stage 2 amendments, and we will certainly reserve the right to try and strengthen those further if we don't believe that they are in the way that we would like to see them in the amendments that are brought forward. The other point I would make, Presiding Officer, is that the timescales here are very tight, and I would urge the Government to give us much advance notice of the detailed amendments as they possibly can, so that the committee can consider these matters before it finally legislates. And that, I'll wind up, and can I offer Mike Russell every hope for every success on his acting debut tonight. We know it's not his debut, he's been acting successfully for many years.